Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. It was the kind of silence that crawled into a room and sat on your chest. The lamp in the corner hummed faintly, throwing a yellow glow over the marble tiles that had once felt like a blessing, but now echoed like a curse beneath her careful steps. Nora's vision had been reduced to the vague perception of movement and shadows, but even in the haze, she could still picture the shape of betrayal. Her husband Ekine's voice came through the thin crack of the hallway door, muffled but unmistakably familiar, yet stained now by tones he never used with her anymore, playful, teasing, and foreign. The giggle of a woman drifted out like smoke, curling through the house and seeping into Nora's lungs. There were no raised voices, no slamming doors, nothing loud or scandalous. Just soft treachery playing out behind polished walls. The worst kind of heartbreak isn't the one that comes with thunder, it's the one that arrives barefoot, tiptoeing around your grief until you're drowning in it. Nora stood still, her fingers pressed to the wall, as if trying to hold up the very structure that was beginning to crumble inside her. Her home, once a fortress of laughter and promise, now pulsed with secrets she couldn't yet see, but felt with the intensity of a woman who had loved too well and too blindly. She blinked into the nothingness and whispered a wordless sigh, one that hung in the air like unshed tears. There was no use calling out. She knew Ekine would only tell her it was the television, or the cleaner, or the wind. And she was tired of being lied to with such cheap currency. Her blindness had stolen the daylight, but it hadn't stolen her instinct. And what she felt tonight sat heavy on her like a wet coat in winter. The irony wasn't lost on her how the woman who once ran meetings with a sharp tongue and a sharper mind was now being led around her own house like a guest. Every step Nora took had become a negotiation with memory and muscle. Her business, the one she'd built from scratch with the sweat of countless sleepless nights, was still running, but only because her longtime friend Julia had refused to let it collapse with her. Julia was the kind of friend you didn't find twice in one lifetime. She was a bridge when the river rose. Every morning she came by, cheerful and steady, acting like nothing was broken even when everything was. She would help Nora bathe, choose her clothes, and take her out for short walks that slowly became secret hospital trips. "Don't just sit in the dark," Julia would whisper, tying her scarf. "Let's chase the light together." But chasing the light didn't mean dragging Ekine along. That chapter, Julia had said, was one Nora would have to read alone. And so Nora did. She listened. Oh, how she listened. Every whisper behind closed doors, every pause in Ekine's step when she called his name, every unreturned kiss, every evasive response. The house spoke, even when the people in it did not. She didn't argue or confront anymore. She stored it. She archived every moment like a librarian collecting volumes for a final presentation. Ekine wasn't cruel with his hands, no. His cruelty was quiet, surgical even. He no longer looked at her when he spoke. His touch had become colder than hospital metal, and perhaps the most brutal cut of all, he had stopped calling her my queen. Now she was just Nora, as if stripping the crown from her name could make her any less regal. But she let him believe she was helpless, when in truth she was simply gathering her silence like arrows. It had begun subtly, the shifting weight in their conversations, the sighs he didn't bother hiding, the business meetings he suddenly had every Friday night. He had started smelling like cologne that wasn't his, coming home with laughter tucked into the corners of his voice, and smiling at his phone with a kind of joy he hadn't shown her in months. Nora knew the scent of another woman the way the earth knows rain before it falls. One night she touched the doorknob to the guest room and paused, hearing the rustle of sheets and the muffled hush of complicity. Her fingers curled, but she didn't turn it. She walked away, each step as quiet as prayer, her lips pressed into a line too tired to tremble. That night, in her room, she sat at the edge of the bed for hours, her palms open on her lap like she was waiting to receive something from the heavens, an answer, a sign, a scream that never came. She remembered the day she met Akin, how he stood at her business seminar in a borrowed suit and answered a question with such fire that she gave him a job on the spot. He had eyes that sparkled with hunger and a voice that knew how to charm the dead back to life. She thought she'd found a partner, but now, sitting in that quiet room, she realized she had trained her replacement. He wasn't in love with her anymore. No, he was in love with the comfort she had given him. The wealth, the name, the ease of walking on marble floors he didn't lay. And now that she couldn't see, he thought she couldn't fight. But Nora was learning that the sharpest blades are the ones no one sees coming. Julia came by the next day with a tray of rice and grilled tilapia, setting it down with a gentle clink. "You haven't eaten all day," she murmured, folding a napkin into Nora's lap. "You'll need strength for the storm you're walking into." Nora didn't respond at first, her mind lost in the swirl of voices she'd overheard just hours before. "How do you do it?" she finally asked, her voice low. "How do you hold your peace in a house that's cracking like dry glass?" Julia smiled gently, brushing a strand of hair from her friend's brow. "Because I've learned," she said, "that storms make noise, but it's the ground that decides whether to split or not." That afternoon, as Julia helped her into a cab, Nora's hand brushed against her arm a little tighter than usual. "Take me to the doctor again," she said softly. "Not because I'm afraid, but because I'm tired of walking blind among people who think they're invisible." The cab pulled away, and Akin didn't even ask where she'd gone. He was too busy planning a weekend getaway, with her money, of course. But Nora was no longer the woman who simply waited. She was planning too. Only hers wasn't a vacation. It was a reckoning. And unlike him, she didn't need a passport, just time, and the truth she was now ready to see. The air inside the hospital smelled like fresh paint and quiet hope. It was Nora's third visit in 6 weeks, each one cloaked in layers of secrecy and resolve. She held Julia's hand tightly, not for fear, but for steadiness, like a warrior tying her sandals before battle. The receptionist didn't recognize her anymore. Maybe it was the sunglasses, or the scarf wrapped neatly around her face. Or maybe it was the way she walked now, no longer defeated, but deliberate, like a woman walking through fire with oil on her back and still daring it to catch. They didn't come through the main entrance anymore. Julia had made arrangements with the back unit, a quiet corridor where only select patients entered. The surgeon was already waiting, a man with salt and pepper hair and a voice that calmed storms. His hands were steady, his tone patient, and he never spoke as if he was doing her a favor. "The procedure is delicate," he had said, adjusting his glasses, "but you've got strong optic nerves. We just need to clear the fog that's decided to live there." Nora had smiled faintly, not because of optimism, but because for the first time in months, someone had spoken to her as if she mattered beyond her money or weakness. The surgery wasn't long, but the wait felt like time had been placed in a slow cooker. Julia paced the hallway, whispering prayers she never admitted to believing in. And when the nurse finally came out, her face soft with good news, Julia covered her mouth and let her knees meet the floor quietly. Nora opened her eyes 2 days later in a private recovery suite that overlooked nothing but white blinds. But behind her lashes, the world was beginning to make sense again. Shapes were returning. Color was crawling back. And light had never felt so personal. She didn't say a word for hours, just stared at the ceiling like it held the map of her entire journey. The war had not ended, but she could finally see her enemy again. The days that followed became rehearsals in silence. Nora didn't call Akin. She didn't text. She didn't even tell him she was out of the house. Julia had helped cover her tracks, instructing the driver to keep the gate closed and the staff on strict instructions that Madame was resting deeply and should not be disturbed. And like most men who get too comfortable, Akin never noticed her absence. He was neck-deep in his lies, too busy picking new curtains for his fantasy life to notice the foundation beneath his reality was cracking. Nora used the quiet days in recovery to build her new plan, one that didn't require shouting or tears, just strategy and timing. She reviewed her company's financial statements with her left eye still bandaged, each line on the document another betrayal signed in her name. He had moved over 28 million naira into a phantom supplier's account. The address didn't exist, the name was fake, but the bank alerts were real. Julia cross-checked everything with a forensic precision that would make a detective blush. "He thinks you're still asleep," she whispered one night while feeding Nora pap. "So let him dream. But when you wake him, let it be with thunder." Nora chuckled, not because it was funny, but because it was true. She felt like a storm gathering under a blue sky, quiet but inevitable. The recovery was slower than she expected, not physically, but emotionally. Sometimes she stared in the mirror and wondered who was looking back. Her face had changed slightly, less softness, more angles. Her eyes were no longer just for seeing, they were for watching, measuring, preparing. One night, she asked Julia to bring her a framed photo of her wedding. She looked at it for a long time. Akin's smile had been wide, almost boyish. Hers had been softer, hopeful. She ran a finger across his printed face and whispered, "You should have known better than to bet against the woman who built you." Back at the house, the staff were starting to whisper. Akin's late-night visitors were no longer subtle. One maid claimed she saw him kiss a woman in the kitchen. Another said she heard laughter in the bathtub. But no one said a word to Akin. They all believed Nora still couldn't see, and he made no effort to respect the memory of her presence. He had moved into the master bedroom completely, sending her items into the guest wing and claiming she preferred quiet. Keisha, the latest visitor, was no longer hiding. She left hair extensions on the sink, drank wine from Nora's glassware, and once asked the cook to make her the same pepper soup Nora loved. The disrespect was now a sport. And while Akin soaked in his delusion, Nora returned home under the cover of dusk, her eyes hidden behind dark lenses, her gait slow but sure. The driver pulled into the compound quietly. No fanfare, no horn. She walked in and greeted the maid. "Tell Oga I'm back," she said plainly, heading straight to the guest room. The maid's jaw dropped. Not because Madame was back, but because she had looked her in the eye. For the next few days, Nora kept the act alive. She wore sunglasses indoors. She fumbled intentionally. She asked for assistance even when she didn't need it. But behind closed doors, she was gathering every thread of evidence, every receipt, every detail. Akin didn't know it, but he was living inside a countdown. Each act of betrayal he performed was just another number falling from the clock, and when the final second struck, she would not raise her voice. She would raise her hand, and everything he thought was his would be returned to her like a prize he never deserved. On the fifth evening, she sat in the parlor wearing one of her old caftans, her legs tucked beneath her like a queen resting after war. Akin walked in, smelling of imported liquor and another woman's perfume, his tie loose, his shirt half open. He didn't greet her, just glanced at her like an afterthought. Nora didn't flinch. Instead, she said, "I had a dream that I could see again." He laughed, cruel and thoughtless, like a man who believed he had already won. "Dreams are for children, Nora," he said, pouring himself a drink. "Focus on resting. That's all you need to do now." She smiled gently, nodding as if in agreement. But inside her, something shifted. That night, she opened the hidden safe in her closet, took out the backup company seal, and signed the transfer papers Julia had prepared. The house was hers. The company was hers. But now, the truth would be hers too. Akin thought he had played chess against a woman without sight. But what he never realized was that while he was busy moving pawns, she had become the queen, quiet, calculated, and now fully awake. The morning after Nora signed the transfer documents, the air inside the house shifted like something sacred had changed direction. Even the curtains moved as if stirred by hands unseen. Nora sat on the balcony in her brown cotton wrapper, sipping tea with fingers steady as stone, the steam rising like unanswered questions. Akin was in the kitchen with Keisha, humming a tune too lively for a man married to silence. The young woman's laugh floated through the house again, careless and shrill, as if she had moved in permanently. Nora heard the clink of glasses, the fizz of soda, the creak of bar stools, and still she remained still. She wore dark sunglasses and leaned on her cane, even though she no longer needed it. Pretending was no longer just a strategy, it was her armor. The more they thought she was weak, the more space they gave her to move. She had become a ghost in her own house, invisible to the very people she was watching. Akin no longer knocked before entering rooms. He had grown drunk on his imagined power. And Keisha, bold as a lioness who thought the old queen was dying, now wore Nora's slippers around the compound. She had taken to adjusting picture frames and adding her own lipstick to Nora's drawers, as if permanence could be achieved through possession. But things were not as they seemed. The floor beneath their feet was no longer steady. Nora had begun calling meetings at the company again, quiet ones. The board members thought she was bedridden. They were wrong. With Julia's help, she had begun reshuffling positions, replacing key personnel, and freezing accounts that bled into Akin's ventures. Still, she said nothing at home. Let them dance, she thought. A person who celebrates too early might soon discover the trophy was never theirs. Akin had begun sensing something off, though he couldn't quite name it. He was like a man sitting in a boat with a slow leak, smiling at the shore while water crept into his shoes. He noticed that certain business calls weren't returning his messages. A supplier who used to greet him like royalty now gave vague answers. He blamed it on market shifts, timing, bad luck. Never once did he consider that the storm was coming from inside his own roof. One afternoon, he barged into Nora's space with a tone soaked in arrogance. "Are you okay?" he asked, leaning against the doorway with his phone in one hand and wine in the other. "You haven't needed anything lately." She tilted her head slowly, the corners of her lips curling with soft irony. "No," she said calmly, "I'm just trying to see the world differently." He chuckled, oblivious. "Still dreaming of seeing again?" he mocked, gently sipping. She nodded. "Some dreams wait for the right time." And with that, he walked away, satisfied by her passiveness. But Nora had already mailed digital copies of his fake vendor contracts to her private attorney, who had opened an investigation. She had also documented the movements of Keisha within the house, every visit, every item taken, every inappropriate touch caught on the small security camera Julia had tucked behind a flower vase. Akin had dismissed the house staff from regular cleaning duties, claiming he and Keisha liked their privacy. But it only made it easier for Nora to collect evidence undisturbed. There was a quiet fever burning in her belly now, not of rage, but of purpose. Every lie they spoke, every secret kiss they thought was hidden, was fuel. It was no longer about revenge. It was about reclaiming herself from the ashes of pity. A woman who has suffered in silence doesn't rise with noise. She rises with results. 2 weeks later, Julia came over dressed in all black, her face glowing with anticipation. She didn't hug Nora when she entered. Instead, she placed a black envelope on the table and whispered, "It's ready." Nora didn't open it right away. She traced her fingers across the edge like one might hold a knife they planned to use gently but deeply. Inside were papers, the final nail in the coffin of Akin's fantasy. A transfer of ownership, asset freezes, legal filings, testimonies from silent staff members. Nora took a breath that didn't tremble. "It's time," she said, folding the document and tucking it beside her hip like a seasoned warrior preparing for court. But first, she planned one final performance. She wanted him to fall in full view of his own shadow. So that evening, she requested a dinner. Akeem looked surprised when the maid relayed the message. "She wants to eat," he asked, laughing. "Maybe she's finally realizing I'm the only one she's got." He arrived at the dining table in a gold chain and new wristwatch, Keisha beside him in a sleeveless gown, smelling of new perfume and shamelessness. Nora sat at the head of the table, dressed in a flowing white dress that whispered power. "I wanted to eat with my husband," she said sweetly, "and the guest he never formally introduced." Keisha blinked, unsure whether it was sarcasm or senility. Akeem just laughed. "We're all family here," he said, pouring drinks. But Nora didn't smile. She removed her sunglasses slowly, and for the first time, looked directly into Keisha's eyes. "You've left your earrings in my bathroom twice," she said. "I placed them in the drawer you keep forgetting to close." Akeem's hand froze mid-pour. Keisha's lips parted, no sound escaping. The silence that followed was louder than thunder. He tried to recover, stumbling over excuses like a drunk grasping for balance. You can see," he stammered, voice cracking. Nora didn't blink. "For weeks now," she replied coolly. "But I wanted to confirm what blindness couldn't lie about." She stood then, taller than shame, and placed the black envelope in front of him. "Read it. Or don't. Either way, you'll understand it soon enough." Keisha stood abruptly, stammering something about being misled, but Nora raised one finger. "Sit." Her voice cut the air like a whip. "You'll leave after he does." Akeem fumbled through the documents, his eyes darting, sweat forming at his brow. His name was no longer on the company's board. His accounts were frozen. His access revoked. The cars were registered under the business. The house, under Nora's trust. He owned nothing now but his boxers and broken pride. "You can't do this to me," he whispered, desperation creeping in. "I built this life with you." Nora laughed, a sound rich with layers. "No, Akeem. I built you, and you tried to sell me for parts." She stepped back, the full glow of the chandelier bathing her in quiet triumph. "You don't live here anymore," she said. "There's a bag already packed for you by the door. Julia will escort you out. You can take Keisha. Or not. Either way, I'm done feeding traitors from my table." And just like that, the room shifted again. Not from fear, but from freedom. The suitcase sat by the entrance like an unwanted guest, zipped tightly as if trying to hold in the shame it carried. Akeem stood beside it, shoulders hunched in a posture that no longer belonged to a man, but to a hollowed version of one. The silence in the house had changed texture. It wasn't sorrowful anymore. It was final. The kind of quiet that came after a gavel strikes wood or a door slams shut with purpose. He looked around the house that once bowed to his commands, the marble floors, the silk curtains, the framed degrees that didn't bear his name. For the first time, they felt like strangers staring back at him, whispering, "You never earned us." Keisha, once bold as brass, now stood at a corner clutching her purse like it held the last shreds of her dignity. She dared not speak. Nora's words still hovered in the air like smoke after fire. Julia, standing tall with the document still in her bag, pointed toward the gate. "Driver is waiting," she said, voice low but sharp. Akeem didn't move. He turned to Nora one last time, lips trembling like a man whose breath had turned into gravel. "You don't have to do this," he mumbled. "We can start again. I was just lost." Nora stepped forward, her face unreadable. "I gave you a compass," she said coldly. "You broke it, then mocked me for not having direction." His jaw clenched, eyes glossed over, but no words came. What was there to say? that he had gambled her love like chips at a table and lost everything, that his greed had worn a crown in a kingdom he didn't build. No excuse fit. He bent slowly, picked up the suitcase, and walked out. Keisha followed like a shadow with no more light to cling to. The sound of the gate locking behind them was soft, but in Nora's chest it roared like justice. That night the moon rose slowly, bathing the compound in a silver glow that looked like forgiveness but wasn't. Nora sat in the sitting room alone, no longer leaning on anything, not a cane, not a friend, not her past. Her eyes scanned the space as if reintroducing herself to it. The chandelier glistened without trying. The sofas looked fuller, as if sighing in relief that the weight of lies had finally left. She sipped water from a glass she once couldn't locate on her own. Now she could see its rim, feel its temperature, understand its weight. Little things, but everything had changed. She thought about how blindness had once felt like death, a cruel tomb without finality. But losing her sight had peeled her open, stripped her of illusion, and handed her a new vision, one that could see through laughter and beneath sweet words. Julia entered quietly and placed a file on the table. "Here's everything," she said. "Statements, proof of asset recovery, signed withdrawal from the board, and a note from one of the girls who used to come around." Nora raised an eyebrow. "A note?" Julia nodded. Turns out Keisha wasn't the first. She was just the loudest. Some of them didn't even know you were still living here. He told them you were gone. Nora didn't flinch. She opened the file, glanced through it slowly. The names, the receipts, the dates. Akin had made betrayal a business. But she didn't cry. She didn't rage. She closed the file gently and looked up. "This is how graves are built," she said. "Not with sand. With secrets." Julia didn't speak. She just nodded, poured herself a drink, and joined Nora on the couch. Two women. One silence. No pity, no regrets. Just the sacred understanding that storms don't warn when they come, but when they leave, the sky becomes honest again. The days that followed were quieter, not because nothing happened, but because everything that needed to happen already had. Nora resumed office, not with press or announcements, but with grace. She wore soft colors and harder expressions. The staff didn't ask questions. They adjusted. Those loyal to Akin had either resigned or been reassigned. Julia was officially named executive partner. The energy in the building shifted. People worked with their backs straighter, their voices lower. Nora's presence wasn't loud, it was commanding. She no longer needed to speak too much. She had become a woman whose eyes told full sentences. On her third day back, she walked past a junior manager who once ignored her calls during her illness. He greeted her with unnecessary cheer. She paused, looked him square in the face, and simply said, "We don't do fake here anymore." Then walked on. That afternoon, a letter of resignation appeared on her desk. The new office atmosphere wasn't tense. It was trimmed, like a garden that had been overgrown with weeds and finally restored. At home, she started opening windows she once left closed. Light returned not just to her eyes, but to the corners of the house. She gave old clothes away, rearranged furniture. She even bought herself a new bed, not because the old one was broken, but because she wanted to break the memory of everything that happened in it. There's a cleansing that comes after a quiet war, not with holy water, but with choice. Nora had made hers. And now, she lived like a woman who had forgiven the version of herself that stayed too long at a table where love had left. One evening, 2 weeks after Akin left, Nora stood in front of the mirror in her room, dressed in a deep green wrapper and coral beads. It was her late mother's birthday. She hadn't celebrated it in years. But that day, she felt the need to honor the woman who once told her, "Never beg anyone to see you. If they shut their eyes, wait. If they keep them shut, walk." She whispered the words aloud, kissed her fingers, and touched the edge of the mirror. Then she stepped out to the compound where a few invited guests waited. Old staff, loyal board members, two of her cousins, and Julia. The event wasn't grand, but it was sacred. Food was served. Music played softly. And Nora, for the first time in a long while, laughed without suspicion. When someone asked her what had changed, she replied, "I stopped trying to fix a house that was built with borrowed bricks." At the edge of the party, a young girl approached her, no older than 19. She had been hired as a cleaner 2 days ago. The girl said quietly, "Ma, I heard what happened, but you walk like it never touched you." Nora smiled and replied, "It touched me, but I didn't let it stain me." The girl nodded in awe, and Nora turned to join the gathering again. Behind her, the sky turned gold, the kind of gold that only comes after the clouds have finished crying. It was a Saturday morning, drenched in lazy sunlight, when the first message arrived. Nora was sitting on the front porch, barefoot, a glass of cold Zobo resting against her palm like a quiet trophy. The scent of fried plantain drifted through the compound from the kitchen, where Julia was humming as she turned over each golden slice. Birds called across the hedges like old friends exchanging gossip. But all that peace came to a full stop when her phone buzzed twice in quick succession. She didn't rush. Nora had learned the art of not giving chaos the satisfaction of urgency. She took one more sip, placed the glass gently beside her, and unlocked the screen. The message came from a blocked number, but she recognized the tone immediately. It reeked of panic and bruised ego. "Nora, please. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Just pick my call. Please." She read the text twice, then tapped the speaker icon beside a voice note. Akine's voice spilled out, raw and shaky. "I can't eat. I can't sleep. They've frozen everything. Nora, even my phone line is being investigated. I'm begging you, please. Let's talk." But there was no apology in his voice. Just fear. The kind of fear that visits men when the women they betrayed stop speaking. She didn't reply. She didn't even frown. She simply tapped delete and scrolled down to another voice note that had arrived earlier, this one from an unknown woman claiming to be Keisha's cousin. It was a strange recording, almost embarrassed, where the girl apologized on Keisha's behalf, saying she didn't know Nora was still living in the house. "She regrets everything," the girl said, "but it's too late now." Nora sighed softly. Regret, to her, had become a currency she no longer accepted. People always remembered the value of loyalty after the door had closed behind them, but not everyone deserved a second knock. Later that day, while sorting through a box of old photo albums in her study, Nora stumbled upon a set of letters she had once written to herself, dated years ago, when she and Akine were still new in marriage. The handwriting was softer, the ink lighter, the tone drenched in innocence. She read through them like a stranger reading someone else's diary. "He says I'm his beginning and end," one line read. "He kissed my eyes this morning and said if they ever stopped seeing him, he would stop breathing." Nora scoffed under her breath. "He must be dead now then," she murmured. The letters felt like fossils, remnants of a time when love wore rose-colored glasses and dreams had no bruises. She considered burning them, but instead she folded them carefully and placed them in a small wooden box, locking it and placing the key in her Bible. Not because she wanted to keep the pain, but because she had earned the memory. Not every lesson had to be discarded. Some were meant to be stored like old war medals, not to be worn, but to remind you what you survived. As she turned to leave the study, her phone rang again. This time, it was from her estate lawyer. The voice on the other end was calm but clipped. "Mrs. Osei, you might want to come in. There's been an attempt to access one of the old properties. Your husband tried to transfer it under a relative's name. We've blocked it, but you'll need to sign a statement." Nora smiled quietly. "Of course," she said. "I'll come in tomorrow." She hung up and looked out the window, her eyes narrowing into the distance. Akeem wasn't done yet. He was clawing through the rubble, hoping to find one last coin in the ashes. But Nora had swept the floor clean. If he wanted to fight her in the dark, he would have to do it blind, because now she was the one holding the light. The next morning, Nora wore a navy blue blouse tucked into a wine-colored wrapper, paired with low heels and a confidence that didn't need earrings. She walked into the lawyer's office with a calm presence, her hair wrapped in a scarf that framed her face like royalty. The receptionist stood up immediately. "Ma, welcome," she said with awe. Inside the office, her lawyer, Mr. Igui, gestured for her to sit. "We've filed the complaint," he began, placing a document in front of her. He used a third party, his cousin from the East, but the signature didn't match, and the registrar flagged it. "We've reported him to the board for fraud attempt." Nora read through the papers with grace. Her hand didn't shake. Her eyes didn't blink. She signed with swift precision and said, "Thank you. Make sure the report is public." Igwe looked up, surprised. "You want this to go public?" Nora nodded. "Let him learn that shadows don't protect thieves forever." After the meeting, she walked past a newsstand where a local paper's headline read, "Socialite husband caught in property fraud scandal. Wife declines comment." Nora bought the paper, folded it into her bag, and continued walking to her car. Her driver opened the door, and she slid in without a word. On the way back, they passed the very house Akeem had tried to steal, a small bungalow on the edge of town she had once renovated for her late aunt. As they passed it, Nora didn't even look. Some things weren't worth revisiting. "Ma," the driver said gently, "do you think Oga will stop now?" Nora leaned back in her seat, her eyes half closed. A man who steals from a blind woman doesn't fear God. He only stops when consequences grow teeth. And in her silence, the car rolled forward, leaving behind yet another attempt swallowed by justice. Back home, evening light fell across the compound like golden cloth spread for royalty. Julia was seated outside already, reading a book with her glasses pushed low on her nose. She looked up as Nora approached and said, "You look like someone who just buried her past." Nora smiled faintly, pulled out the newspaper, and handed it to her. Julia read the headline and shook her head. "So it's out now," she muttered. "Good." Nora didn't reply. She sat beside her, poured herself a glass of juice, and raised it like a toast. "To everything we never begged for, and everything we refused to lose." Julia clinked her glass against Nora's and said, seeing clearly even in darkness. The sound of laughter from children playing outside floated into the compound like a song without lyrics. Nora turned her gaze toward the gate. There was no one there. No bags. No tears. Just a piece so sharp it could slice through history. That night, as she lay in bed, she opened her journal and wrote one sentence before closing it again. "He thought blindness was my weakness, but I was watching him long before my eyes healed." The rain came without warning, sweeping through Riven Hill with the kind of grace that didn't ask for permission. It tapped gently on the roof like an old friend checking in after a long journey. Inside her home, Nora stood by the window, arms folded beneath her chest, her gaze settled on the gray sky as if reading something only she could understand. The last few weeks had unfolded like a final chapter long overdue. The scandal had caught fire, Akeem's name dragged across headlines, company groups, even family chats. Photos from his arrest at the Property Commission's office spread across social media like gospel. Disheveled shirt, unshaven jaw. A man once groomed by privilege, now reduced to pitiful explanation. Yet through all of it, Nora never said a word. Her silence had become her signature. And though many tried to bait her with questions, journalists, former friends, even curious neighbors, she remained a fortress wrapped in stillness. She wasn't hiding. She was watching. observing how the world spins differently when you stop chasing applause. The house had taken on a different rhythm now. The silence was no longer empty, it was peaceful. She no longer waited for footsteps at night. No more paused breaths when her phone rang. No more rehearsing responses to lies. She simply lived. Sometimes she would cook something simple, okra soup, rice and sauce, or peppered yam, just because she wanted to taste joy without any occasion. It wasn't about celebration. It was about reclaiming the small things, the things Akeem never saw because he was too busy counting coins in the dark. Nora leaned her head gently on the glass, eyes half-lidded, and whispered, "Let the rain take what it must. What's meant to remain will never wash away." The following week, Julia insisted they take a short trip, a weekend away from everything familiar. "You need to breathe in a place where nobody looks at you like a story," she said, waving two small travel bags like tickets to freedom. Nora smiled. "Where are we going?" "Nowhere loud," Julia replied. "Just air, sky, and quiet that isn't haunted." They left the next morning for a hilltop retreat in the outskirts of Edenvale, a small town laced with tall trees, clean streets, and the scent of wet soil that clung to the wind like perfume from the heavens. The cabin was modest but beautiful, open windows, a wraparound porch, and flowers that bent gently to greet every breeze. On the second evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in wine and gold, Nora stepped out barefoot to the edge of the porch. Her wrapper fluttered against her ankles, her scarf loose around her neck. Julia stood behind her, holding a steaming cup of tea. "You don't talk much these days," she said gently, handing it over. Nora accepted the cup and said, "That's because I spent years explaining myself to someone who already decided not to hear me." Julia nodded. "And now?" Nora turned slowly. "Now, I want to listen to myself." They sat together as the sky tucked itself beneath the mountains. No need for music. No need for closure. Some endings arrive not with applause, but with acceptance. And as stars began appearing one by one, Nora leaned her head against the wooden beam of the porch and said, "It's strange, isn't it, that the man who thought I couldn't see is now the one invisible?" Julia smiled and replied, "That's what happens when your power never depended on your eyes in the first place." The final blow came not with Nora's doing, but from the very system Akeem had manipulated. The same false documents he had used to try and steal her properties had been tied to two other cases under investigation, both involving forged signatures, one implicating an elderly widow in another state. When the second victim came forward, Akeem's previous sins resurfaced like buried bones in rain. Nora sat in her office when the news arrived, a breaking story on national radio, naming him as the link across 3 fraud cases. She didn't celebrate. She simply leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping lightly on the wooden desk, and let out a long, slow breath. Justice didn't always ride in on a chariot. Sometimes it walked in with dusty feet, but it arrived all the same. That evening, she wrote a single email to her accountant, requesting that a small fund be set aside each month for an emergency shelter in Riven Hill, one that offered legal aid for women silenced in their marriages. She didn't name it after herself, didn't post about it. She just did it, quietly, like planting a tree she'd never need shade from. Then she closed her laptop, turned off the lights in her office, and stepped outside into the night air. The sky was clear, the moon full, no cameras, no witnesses, just her, free, whole, and unnamed by anyone else's sin. And as the wind wrapped around her shoulders like a shawl, she said softly, "He was right about one thing. My eyes were closed, but not because I couldn't see. I just hadn't yet chosen what to look at." On the last Sunday of that month, Nora returned to the estate chapel for the first time since the storm began. She didn't wear her usual lace or heels. Instead, she dressed in a simple encore skirt and a white blouse, her hair pulled back, no earrings. As she walked in, heads turned, whispers followed, but no one dared interrupt her quiet stride. She sat in the third row and closed her eyes as the choir sang softly. Midway through the service, the pastor began preaching about restoration, not the loud kind with fanfare, but the kind that happens inside, like new skin growing beneath old wounds. At one point, he said, "Sometimes God closes your eyes so you can finally see what you refuse to look at." Nora opened her eyes slowly and exhaled. It felt like the final piece of a heavy puzzle had clicked into place. After service, as people trickled out, an elderly woman approached her. "My daughter," she said, holding Nora's hand gently, "whatever you lost, heaven saw it. And what you have now, don't ever give it back to anyone who only wants to spend it." Nora smiled, held the woman's hand for a moment longer, then walked toward the exit. Outside, the sun was warm, the ground firm, and as she crossed the courtyard, a little girl ran past her, laughing, her mother chasing behind. The child paused, looked up at Nora, and said, "You have strong eyes." Nora knelt to her level, cupped her cheek, and said, "And now I use them wisely." Then she stood, straightened her blouse, and walked forward, not away from the past, but beyond it, toward a peace that wasn't borrowed, but earned. Never mistake silence for weakness, nor gentleness for blindness. Sometimes the quietest people are simply gathering strength. If someone ever tries to use your vulnerability against you, remember, wisdom watches even with closed eyes. Don't rush to expose what time can reveal. Protect your peace, reclaim your power, and let your healing speak louder than your hurt. May your eyes never grow dim to the truth around you. May God give you the strength to rise when you're overlooked, the wisdom to see what others try to hide, and the courage to walk away from what no longer honors your worth. May your silence carry power, your scars carry wisdom, and your future shine brighter than the lies that tried to bury you. You will never be stranded. You will never be small. Your peace will overflow like a river that refuses to dry. In Jesus' name, you will rise, rebuild, and rejoice. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.